Okay, so this is going to be a post-mortem for the Bellwether incident, which is a game I created for Ludum Dare 39. If you are planning on playing and rating the game, go do that now. Play the game first. I don't want to influence your opinions of it or your first impression. So pause this video, maybe come back after you've played it. Okay. If you haven't played it, this is what the game kind of looks like. You are controlling these three robots around this nuclear power plant and doing things like closing these radioactive containers, activating computer terminals, that sort of stuff. You move around, you issue commands to these robots and tell them to do things. I'm going to click through here. It takes a couple turns to do this stuff. Then you come back to the kind of level select screen here where you are like kind of moving through this power plant and fixing things, and then at the end you're done. So that's the game, basically. And I want to talk about my thoughts on it and how the development process went, things like that. Visually, I think the game looks great. I think like it turned out really well. Like this looks really sharp. The transitions are really good. Like it looks really good. Somebody mistook this for a 3D game in the comments, and I'm that's pretty good, because it's not. This is not a 3D game. This is secretly a 2D game. All of these assets are rendered out in 2D tile sets and then rendered to the screen, and I want to talk about that process. But you couldn't tell. You can only really tell in a few very specific scenarios where the layering gets a little bit confused because of some of the transitions when the bots jump around. But I think, like I said, visually it looks good. It's a fairly consistent style. The colors kind of offsetting the enemies, and kind of the goals are stand out. Your guys are all kind of orange. There's a color scheme going on here. I think the audio is pretty good. This is the first Ludum Dare game where I've done music, I think. I've tried several times and it has ended poorly, but I'm pretty proud of what I did for like 40 minutes, and I'm not a musician at all, and it's probably awful, but it doesn't annoy me as much as some audio music for LD games goes. The mixing levels are a little problematic. Some of the specific effects aren't great, but overall, visually it looks great. The audio I think is really great. But here's the but. The gameplay I think is really disappointing. It really didn't meet what I wanted. It didn't meet my goals. And so I'm pretty disappointed. And I'm gonna talk more about that later, but I wanted to kind of just frame kind of the development process and where I was coming from and how I ended up here. So I'm gonna kind of close this. So this game's created solo by me in 48 hours in C#. I use Monogame, and I've got a fairly sizable custom library that I've been building over like 7 years of just kind of handy code and state management and some other things. For assets, I use SketchUp, Paint.net, SFXR, and Audio Tool. And this is my 10th Ludum Dare game, so I've got a fair bit of code from that to kind of draw from, and a fair bit of code from some commercial releases to draw from. So that's all pretty handy. The original idea came from an article I'd read about the Fukushima disaster and some of the cleanup efforts, and why it was so difficult for robots to explore certain areas of the reactor core and things like that. And it was kind of getting into like, well, they have these robots that can get through these access tunnels, but those aren't really built for underwater, which is where the reactor is kind of now. Or like they could send these things in, but if they get stuck, they're jammed, and now those things are blocked, and they have to get them out. And so that was kind of an interesting read, and then that was kind of the spark for this game. After the theme was announced, that's just a spark of an idea, and I didn't know where to go with it. Kind of one of my initial ideas was more like a programming game, in the sense of like a programming board game where you're programming movement by saying go here, turn left, go here, turn left. I'd kind of thought about like a roguelike exploration thing. I've done a roguelike before, didn't really want to do it. But I set on the idea of what would a turn-based tactics game look like if combat wasn't the focus. And that's kind of where I kind of started thinking about the game. I thought about like a campaign mode, and I'd kind of thought, well, what about kind of Darkest Dungeons approach to like a campaign of instead of the mansion, it's a nuclear plant, and you're kind of going in and doing stuff. And in between rounds, you're like repairing the robots and building new ones from parts you find, and that will be an interesting trade-off. I didn't want it to be a puzzle game. That was kind of from the beginning. I was like, it's just going to be a Sokoban clone if I do that. I don't want to do that. I want to do something different. For art style, isometric was a pretty easy choice. I didn't think too hard about others. I knew I was going to do 2D rendering, so if you're talking about 2D art assets for a game, it's either you go up, down, left, right, and then you have at the very least 3 images for left, right, and then up and down can't be mirrored. With isometric, you can get away with 2 images for front and back, and you can mirror the left or right. And I tried really briefly with like a pixel art style instead of the 3D style that I'd settled on. But that was going to be really manually intensive to try to do that in Paint.net. And Paint.net doesn't have the greatest tools for like an isometric layout, and it wasn't going to be great. I'd tried before working with SketchUp to render things out, and this is the assets file from SketchUp. So these are all the assets in game. And what I would do is I would render these out to a 2D image and slice them up into little tiles that like, let's see, tiles like this. So then I can just position these on screen and with the isometric math and stuff. So this is kind of all the assets in the game. There's another file that has the nuclear power plant, but I do have a couple extensions for SketchUp which might be relevant. I have this handy little thing that lets you retrieve a camera position from memory. That makes sure that I can always go back to this same camera. So if I make changes to the assets, I can render it out from the exact same perspective. I can just pan around to this and grab all the assets I need to render out. And that helps kind of get all this stuff right, and makes it so I can update assets when I need to, because I did do that several times, updating assets. So yeah, took those out to Paint.net and did just chopped them up and put them in the game. I'll show briefly the power plant. Same basic idea. I'm using shadows here. I wasn't in the other one. The shadows for all the bots are actually just done by hand. The shadows are a little bit limited in SketchUp. But anyway, that's SketchUp. Want to talk a little bit about level generation. I thought about procedural generation briefly. That seems like the thing you would do if this was like a Darkest Dungeon where you're doing random levels in this thing and repeating content. But that's a lot of time, and thinking about the things I want to do and the areas I wanted to create is like that's going to take a little bit too long. I've done it in the past. Sometimes it works. This was not one of those times. What I ended up doing was creating these tiny little images and loading them in, and these are my levels. That's actual size. But this is a level. This is just an image, and like the left side, this is the walls and floors, and over here I have all of the placement of special things on that level. So the spawn location and the radioactive barrels and the enemies. I've done a little bit of this image processing before, and it's really handy to be able to process an image, and this is kind of the first time where it was just, this is my level editor. That worked fairly well, probably less time than hooking up a weird third-party thing. Anyway, what else do I want to talk about? I want to talk about enemy AI briefly. So I probably put maybe a little bit too much thought into the enemy AI. They have a couple different states that they kind of move through, and it was a lot of work that maybe could have been better spent in another place, but they are kind of cool. They are kind of interesting because there's 2 of them and they are acting different. They're not just dumb, follow the player sort of things. Like for that tall robot, this one just sort of turns in place and scans. Like every 4 turns, it picks a random direction and faces that. And then the other one kind of walks between 2 points, and when every tick it will try to go towards its current target, and if it's there, it'll go back to the other one. Then they have some states for if they get too far away, they'll kind of try to go back to where they were. And every turn they'll look to see, is the player in their vision cone? If the player's in their vision cone, they will use this last state here to chase the player down, which just sort of goes in their general direction, and there's a little bit of randomness. It's not full path finding like the player has. So you can kind of trick them and get them stuck into corners and stuff. It's fairly basic, but I thought that was kind of interesting, and it was good, though I didn't think I'd need to implement vision cones. I didn't realize that until I was kind of halfway through this going, wait a minute, how is this going to be at all interesting? And it's like, well, no, there really needs to be vision cones so that you can kind of see what they're looking at and can avoid them, because if you can't avoid them, like, it's not a real interesting feature. Anyway, I was working through production, and things were going slowly as LD games seem to go. On Saturday, I was starting to curb ideas, the management aspects, kind of all of that, like, oh, Darkest Dungeon, that would be cool. All that went away, which was a problem because I'd started to implement some of those RPG stats, and that's kind of how I thought about the bots, was they have these stats, and certain ones are better at others, and like, oh, you could level them up and make them better at this task. But that no longer really made sense without all of that management aspect. And I kind of wish I'd done it, but I was looking at like all of the work that would be involved in that, like a character select screen and like the UI for upgrades and things like that. Is like, it doesn't sound that bad until you really kind of think about it and go like, oh, that's like all of these individual things have to be thought out, and like, so wish I could, but cut that pretty early. And so I had the 3 robots, let's just stick with those and we'll make it better for those 3. But without that, it's sort of a puzzle game, but it's not a very good one. The 3 robots don't really interact. There's not much of a reason to even command one of them usually. Like, you can just kind of win with just moving 1 or maybe 2. So with the elements I coded, it wasn't even much more than like a Sokoban clone, which is what I was trying to avoid. But, you know, that's what it was, and it was kind of too late to really change directions Saturday night. But I was hoping for more. It did not work out. I usually aim my sights a little too high on these things. So the game came together pretty late without that puzzle refinement and the weird mechanics. Like, it really needed a tutorial. And I'd kind of want to do some story, because without any context, it's kind of like, it doesn't totally make sense what you're doing. I mean, it kind of, maybe it does, but I wanted to be more explicit about it. I like kind of embedding story into the game a little bit more for these LD games, if I can. So I'd grabbed a bunch of dialogue code that I'd used for a point-and-click adventure game a while ago and kind of repurposed it a little bit and made it try to work for what I need to here. I'll kind of open that up. It's kind of a neat system, and it's pretty convenient. Oh no, I don't want to hear. Where's that actual code? Game. Or it's fairly easy to kind of build up this sort of dialogue tree and just let it run, and it's easy to write text this way. So that's what I did, was I wrote a lot of text. I definitely tried to polish over a few issues by writing sentences, and that's not great, because I'd forgotten that you cannot click through the dialogue in that code. I'd forgotten that that was not a thing until late. But as an example of trying to polish over issues, like, I knew it wasn't super clear what your goal was. Like, what are you doing in these levels? And so there's a couple sentences in there saying, like, you need to reset these terminals and you need to cap these radioactive barrels. And it's really not, like, the first impression of the game is not very intuitive of, like, what am I doing with these things? I get these little bouncy highlights over these robots. What does that actually mean? What do I do? And why can't I just click on the crate? I'm sending commands to them. I move them. It's a move command, and then separately I send a command to push the box. It's maybe not great separately, but it's definitely not intuitive. So there's a lot of sentences in there, too many, but there's a lot of sentences of kind of this dialogue telling you how to do things. Yeah, I tried to add the click-through thing, but it was really late when I realized that wasn't there, and that was going to be a problem. And I knew it was going to be a problem if I didn't finish it, but the system's just not built for it. It's built in a way that's just running a cutscene, basically, is what it's for. So I'd forgotten about that. It's handy in certain ways. Let me do that like decision of, like, do you want to do the tutorial again? Though I only added that thinking that I would need it because people would need to restart because I didn't have a way to like continue when you lose. So you might want to quit and restart without doing the tutorial. Yeah, dumb decisions all around. Really though, I ran out of time to really refine the levels. I'm not super happy with them. I tried to kind of make puzzly elements with what I had. Like you can kind of position crates in a way to like lock the enemies in. This is a good example. So like you can kind of push this crate forward and like kind of get that enemy stuck potentially and then pick up the battery without avoiding them, or like you don't have to go down this path, you can kind of go through the door here and do the stuff you need to do and kind of ignore that and ignore the batteries. But with the tools I had, that did not end well, I think. And I was largely disappointed with the game because it didn't really meet my initial goals, and as it wasn't particularly fun moment to moment. There's some specific issues with, I've kind of mentioned a few of them. The dialogue is one that's just moment to moment. That's not great. There's too much dialogue. Let me jump into the game again. Right, can't skip dialogue. And actually, I've skipped a bunch already. I've turned a bunch off for debugging just because it's faster. But some of the problems are that I have to move this bot over here, and I have to then do the radioactive thing. Like, that's not great, and there's no real reason to move these other robots in this level. I don't need to. I put in this complex system for these arrows and kind of rendering out its plans and pathfinding around stuff to get them to go places, and that doesn't matter, as it turns out. Like there's never a case, there's almost never a case in this game where you want to like send one robot out to do a thing and at the same time send another robot out to do a thing. And it's kind of balanced to be pretty easy, so part of that is just like the energy doesn't drain very quickly. For like an LD game, that like makes it's probably a generally safer approach. But like there just isn't a purpose to sending these out. And the levels aren't designed in a way where you would want to, because they're usually like start in a place and here's your goal at the other end of the level. And you can kind of move, like the drone is a distraction in at least one level. You can move it over the water and wait for the enemy to kind of focus on him, and you can kind of sneak behind him. I did have like an energize mechanic, so if I how do I actually cancel that movement? I guess I can't. Okay. What I want to show is I can kind of click on this guy and energize him to give him some battery and potentially make the thing he was doing go faster, but that kind of doesn't matter. That's the most interaction these bots really have, and that's kind of disappointing. And I couldn't come up with more, especially in the 2 days. That was just wasn't in the cards. But yeah, like I said, I'm disappointed in the game, and I really don't see a good path forward to make this a better game. Maybe some of those rogue elements would be kind of neat. I think like a larger map would probably like add a level of exploration to it, and probably make it some of that like programming movement make a little bit more sense, because there's more distance between things, and would probably kind of just add options of like you can go this way or you can go this way, and that at least now you have a choice. And some of the management aspects would kind of be similar of, do I want to go out of my way to pick up some robot parts or collect some cash or something? But yeah, the game's not really hooked me either way. Those are options that it kind of sounds like just adding more on top of a not very interesting core loop, though, and that's what I worry about. So, I mean, Leave 'em Dare is a prototype, and this is a prototype, and I don't think it went well. It's a bummer. Maybe next time. Anyway, that's all I wanted to show. So, thanks for listening. Bye.